So it's no secret that Cyberpunk 2077 had a notoriously rocky release back in 2020. This game was so broken and unfinished that they actually had to take it off the PlayStation Store a week after it came out. That's how bad things were looking, and this was kind of shocking at the time. Never before have we seen a game that was this high budget and this popular get so much blowback, to the point where there were over 30,000 refunds of the game. Even more shocking was the fact that Cyberpunk was developed by CD Projekt Red, the same studio that has consistently released great games over the past few decades. However, after years of being clowned on, that didn't stop CDPR from continuing work on Cyberpunk in an attempt to turn it into the game that it was always meant to be, the game they advertised and the game they dreamed of bringing to life in the first place. 3 years have passed since Cyberpunk first release, and 2.1, their final overhaul update of the game, just came out this past week. Not only that, but we also got a major DLC expansion with Phantom Liberty. Back in 2020, I released my first review of Cyberpunk, and my overall impression was that the game was pretty disappointing. Of course, I was frustrated by the sheer amount of bugs in the game, but bigger than that, Cyberpunk never clicked for me. It's surprising because I love the atmosphere of Night City and Cyberpunk as a genre in general, but it felt like as a player there was nothing for me to grab onto. I was so caught up on its shortcomings that I never really gave Cyberpunk a real chance. But it's been 3 years. The game in its current state doesn't resemble what I played back then at all. So I figured I'd finally go back and see if Cyberpunk 2077 is worth playing now. I don't want to waste your time. If you came here to find out the answer to whether or not Cyberpunk works now so that you can play it yourself, for me the answer is yes. But I already assumed that, so instead I wanted to find out what Cyberpunk really has to offer. Now that all the blaring issues with the game have been removed, what am I missing here? I wanted to dive into the corners of Cyberpunk that I completely ignored before, as well as taking a look at some of the new stuff that's been added in recent updates. To kick things off, let's talk about the world of Cyberpunk 2077. To me, this is what the game is all about. You can add all these cool guns and quest lines and abilities all you want, but if I can't drive a fast car through a cyberpunk city at night blasting vaporwave, does any of that other stuff even matter? I say this because that was the attitude I had when the game first came out. I'd say that driving cool cars through Night City was the highlight of the game back then, but honestly, that was because the rest of the open world aspects felt pretty lifeless. The NPCs were very goofy and out of place, and completely took you out of the experience if you were to just walk around. The police encounters were even more goofy because if you do even the smallest thing wrong, an officer would just spawn 10 feet behind you and open fire. I'm not even exaggerating, by the way. You couldn't even have real car chases. Enemies would just spawn around you, and if you were to just get in a car and drive away, they were not going to keep up. Now there actually are real car chases with police and other gangs. I wouldn't say it's at the same level as the Red Dead Redemption wanted system or even the GTA 5 car chases, but they can actually be a lot of fun. Recently, they added the ability to fire guns from your car, which makes these chases feel even more alive. And if you stumble across gang activity in the streets during these pursuits, it can turn into an all-out war. Honestly though, the biggest surprise for me is how little I want to drive cars. Now that the NPC problems have been fixed, walking the streets of Night City is a much more immersive experience. I always thought the NPCs in Cyberpunk were secretly good under all the bugs and glitches, but since now it's all fixed, they are really solid. They still have some issues, like talking to random NPCs is still pretty bad and you have to get right in their face to actually initiate dialogue, but if we're seeing them as just background to everything else, they definitely add to the immersion. Night City used to feel so empty because of the population limitations, but now that it's been cleaned up, NPCs are everywhere and it makes the city feel a lot more alive. I also think I might have misunderstood what Cyberpunk's world was all about in the first place. A lot of this was fixed by watching Edge Runners, the Cyberpunk anime that I honestly can't recommend enough. It's really good, and not just by video game adaptation standards, it's a great story in general. Edge Runners really opened my eyes to what kind of story Cyberpunk is trying to tell in the first place. If I'm being honest, I felt that the classic RPG elements were lacking a bit when I first played Cyberpunk. It seemed like a lot of the focus was put directly into telling V's story than actually letting the player write their own story. Some of this still holds true. I'm not a fan of the fact that the 3 life paths you choose at the beginning don't bear any relevance or consequences besides the first 20 minutes of gameplay. They make you think that choosing between Street Kid, Nomad, and Corpo will come into play later, but it really doesn't, which is kind of unfortunate. I feel like they could have easily thrown in even just one unique quest line down the road related to these life paths to make the choice more meaningful, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. Where I was wrong though was that the other RPG related choices actually do matter. Stuff like upgrading your cyberware and following different paths on the skill tree can dramatically change the way you play the game. This is where Cyberpunk finally clicked for me. These choices aren't directly affecting the story, but instead how you interact with the world around you. If you put all your points into intelligence, for example, you can take out entire gangs with just net running and hacking from afar. On the other hand, you could do pretty much the opposite and put all your points into body and become an absolute tank, picking up enemies and throwing them off buildings. My personal build, and I definitely recommend you guys try it as well, is dividing points into cool and reflexes, which basically turns you into a ninja. The reflex tree has gotten so fun because they added dashes and air dash mechanics that completely change not only how you fight enemies, but how you explore the world in general. There are tons of gang locations and gigs where you can test your skills and make a bit of money. I've really come to appreciate the variety of ways you can approach these jobs, and that's only enhanced by the skill tree. The first time I played, I honestly saw these skills as a limitation when I came across something that I couldn't interact with, whether that's a door you aren't strong enough to open or a computer you aren't upgraded enough to hack into. But now I realize that these limitations are a direct representation of my own choices, and instead of giving up on a job just because plan A doesn't work, there's 100 other ways to approach it with the skills that you do have. It's also important to note that you can refund these skills at any time, giving you plenty of room to experiment and figure out what kind of build actually suits your playstyle. The reason I brought up the Edge Runners anime was because it really opened my eyes to how much potential the Ripper Dock system has too. This is like an entirely different skill tree altogether. You can get simpler upgrades like plates that build your defense, or more dramatic changes like bionic legs that let you double jump. The potential of mixing up these upgrades and the skill tree abilities can mold your character into exactly what you want them to be. I really can't stress this enough. Diving into this side of Cyberpunk was the biggest piece I was missing from my first playthrough. The difference of walking through Night City without any cyberware to literally jumping from building to building as a total machine enhances the experience to a whole other level. My best way to describe it is that Night City went from just another open world set piece to a full-on jungle gym with just these small changes in my playstyle. I think another aspect that added to the immersion of Cyberpunk is all the new features that have been added to the game. For one, there's now an actual functioning metro system with different lines that you can take to different parts of the city. I don't think people will use it a ton aside from a few times to see the unique events that take place there, but it's an added level of immersion to the game that I really appreciate. You can also buy new apartments now, which is a feature that I believe CD Projekt Red advertised before the game came out, but was missing from the base game, so this is a welcome feature for sure. You can even invite other characters to your apartments for dates, and while stuff like this might seem small, it's also the same kind of thing that this game desperately needed. As far as the main story goes, I don't want to go into any detail to avoid spoilers for people who want to give the game a try for themselves, but I will say this: without the clutter of bugs and the wave of negativity surrounding the game when it first released, I think I was able to appreciate the storyline a lot more for what it is. For one, the detailed expressions and animations for characters you talk to is beyond good. Gone are the days of static character models and dialogue. I'm looking at you, Starfield. For real, the fact that the camera is always locked in first person really emphasizes how impressive the attention to detail when it comes to visuals are. Being locked in first person did bother me a bit when I first played the game, especially when I'm so used to seeing my own character in other RPGs, but I totally understand why now. Getting up close and personal with the characters and seeing the detail and emotions in their faces really brings you right into the experience yourself. It is a little unfortunate that they have a super in-depth character creator and a ton of clothing to wear, and yet you can't actually see yourself in the game, but I do understand now why it just worked works better this way. So to answer the question, is Cyberpunk 2077 worth playing today? My answer is yes. It does feel a bit sour that it took this long to have a fully functioning game that actually meets modern standards, but they did it, and honestly, I'm so glad CD Projekt Red didn't give up on Cyberpunk because they turned this game into something really special. The vision they once had for Cyberpunk is finally here, so if you've been on the fence about giving it another try or have been holding off altogether, it's definitely worth playing now. Thanks so much for watching. I also want to mention I really appreciate all of the love and support on the channel lately. It means a lot that I can share my love for gaming with you guys. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Peace.